Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I appreciate that introduction, very humbling remarks. And I think the fact that Diana Rehm talks about infrastructure is more of a testament to her understanding of what's important than it is to anything that I'm doing here. But I'm really excited to be here and to be able to talk to folks, particularly given the U.S. perspective. I think it was great to hear. I was able to hear some of the remarks and the presentations yesterday online. I thought we had a great first start, but particularly to hear the UK remarks that just preceded me here. I'm going to focus my remarks on the US, but it's humbling to follow what they're doing in the UK, particularly because we don't have a whole lot of that analysis that's done here. We don't have a national infrastructure plan. We don't seem to have a lot of the consensus around what's important. We don't really have a definition of infrastructure, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I really appreciate those remarks. And even though we're here in Washington, even though Brookings has been here in Washington for 100 years, I'm not going to focus that much on the federal level. I think a lot of folks think that the federal government is doing all these things in infrastructure. Maybe in the UK and other places they are, but it's a very complicated and very diverse mix of things here in the US. But even if we had, a federal government that was actually functioning, which we don't really have right now, we're in the silly season. You may have heard we have a national election coming up. They're not really talking about infrastructure. I'm really not talking about much of anything, quite frankly. But the good news is that there is change that's happening. There is some movement. I just don't think a lot of it's being driven by folks here in Washington. And that's actually too bad, because we do face an unprecedented set right now of economic, demographic, social, and environmental changes here in the U.S. that really do compel U.S. governments, the private sector, and general citizens to really change the way that we do business. And while all these changes, I think, are incredibly diverse, again, from the changing of the economy to climate change to what's happening in cities and low-income populations, all these things do share one underlying need, and that need is for modern, efficient, and reliable infrastructure. And so it's these tangible assets that are made of, concrete, steel, fiber optic cable. All these things are the essential building blocks to the American economy. It's obviously something that you all know very well. It enables global trade. It powers businesses. It connects workers to jobs. It creates new opportunities for struggling communities. It protects coastlines, particularly from an unpredictable natural environment. And it includes lots of different things. They're private sector-led investments in many ways, in telecommunication systems and in broadband networks. Freight railroads, energy projects, pipelines, and we have publicly available and supported investments in transport, water, public buildings, parks. All of these things really is truly the backbone of the American economy. It also supports infrastructure workers. This is some analysis that we did recently where we found that 14 million people in the United States, 11% of the American workforce is directly employed in infrastructure, not the guy cutting the hair, the guy who's filling in the pothole or something, but directly related to projects in infrastructure writ large. There are generally low barriers to entry for lots of these jobs. They generally pay very well, particularly on the lower end of the income scale. So as we talk about how we're going to kind of boost up the economic conditions of lower income populations, infrastructure jobs are a good way to do that. And they're also expected to grow over the next few years. And infrastructure is also necessary for the achievement of important national goals. We usually don't make these kind of connections. We talk about these things separate from infrastructure. But if we talk about things like connecting to the global economy, if we talk about things like boosting advanced industries, if we talk about things like climate mitigation, sustainability, and resiliency, all of these things, as we heard from the previous speaker, have infrastructure components. But in this country, we don't really make those kind of connections. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So with that as a backdrop, the remarks today are going to focus on three big themes. The first is that there are really disruptive changes that are affecting the conversation around infrastructure right now. And we kind of lose sight of that when we think about infrastructure for infrastructure's sake. We don't think about these big disruptive factors. The second thing is that the current conversation around infrastructure is actually too abstract. It was hard to find an icon to represent abstract for lots of obvious reasons, but the conversation is just about infrastructure broadly and not in the specifics. We have to talk about that. And the third thing is that we do need a new path forward. So given all these changes, what are we not doing today, and how do we move to something that's actually productive, that actually advances the economy for all Americans right now? So first thing, there are these disruptive factors. There are urban historians who look at the changes that are going on right now in the U.S., the demographic, economic, environmental, all these changes together, and say we haven't seen big changes like this in this country in 100 years. It really is truly that transformational of a time right now. I'm just going to tick through a couple of these things. There are four main things I'm going to kind of focus on. One is on demographic and cultural changes, how that's affecting American society. Talk about the changes in the global economy, the energy and environmental disruptions, and then, of course, the political and the financial challenges that we're facing right now. You can throw in technology, you can throw in a lot of different things. We'll focus on just these four to start. And the demographic changes are really important when it comes to infrastructure. Things like the aging and the diversification of the society, shrinking household sizes, really different kind of demographic portfolios in cities and places around the U.S. that we haven't seen before. All of these things and these big changes place new emphasis on things like transportation alternatives and on telecommunications to do things like connecting people and communities. So this chart shows, just for example, we have the percentage of licensed drivers in the U.S. today is the lowest that we've actually seen in decades. Some of that may be the result of the recession, but it's actually continued kind of post-recession. Americans not getting their driver's licenses and not driving as much as we had in the past. The other thing is that the prototypical family of the suburban era in the United States, this married couple with school-aged children, now represents only 20% of the households in the United States, down from about 40-something% just a few decades ago. So the structure of American households are changing. All of that then means different things for how people live, how they work, and how they get around. And when you survey the younger folks, particularly Generation Y and millennials, their preferences for urban living, their preferences for car ownership, their preferences for living near public transit are much different than it was in previous generations. Much higher preferences for different types of locations. The next thing to keep in mind demographically is that we're still a growing country. So unlike parts of Western Europe or unlike parts of Asia, the United States is continuing to grow. We're expecting about 90 million more people by 2050. It's not quite the population that today lives west of the Mississippi River, but it's pretty close. So we're going to have to accommodate an awful lot more growth in this country over the next coming decades. Where is it going to go? Most of this, we think 85 to 90% of it, is going to wind up in cities and metropolitan areas, continuing to place new demands on the U.S. infrastructure system. We must be ready to adapt not only to serve just the new customers, but to make sure that the potential for low-income residents is enhanced, who already face pretty low barriers to economic expansion and have disproportionately high income levels. So, for example, this is some analysis that we did a few years ago looking at transit coverage in the United States and how well people can access transit to get to jobs and economic opportunity. And from this, we found that only about a third of the jobs in U.S. metropolitan areas are accessible in 90 minutes on public transportation. So, I mean, 90 minutes is a long time for someone to spend getting to work every day, but we wanted to make it very broad, and only about 30% of those jobs were accessible. We do a very good job of putting transit into neighborhoods, particularly where populations need it, but as jobs decentralize, as people move further and further out, it's much harder for people to get to the work and the economic opportunities that they need. The next thing is that even though broadband speeds have doubled since 2009 and over 80% of Americans now have access to high-speed wireless broadband, the adoption rates for low-income and minority households really do remain disproportionately low. And the White House talks about this an awful lot. It's about 43 and 56% respectively. So when we think about bridging the digital divide, it's still very real. It's still a very big challenge in cities and metros throughout the U.S. The next big challenge, or the big transformative change you want to talk about, is the economic and the changes that are coming from the globalizing economy. It really matches the social changes that we're facing. About 83% of global GDP growth in the future is going to be occurring outside of the United States, particularly in the BIC countries, in Brazil, India, and China. And this chart shows just the share of the GDP that's going to expect to be growing in those places. All this matters, not in the abstract, but it matters because it connects to infrastructure and transportation here in the U.S. About $51 billion of goods move in and out of the U.S. each day. And so that places lots of emphasis on things like ports, on the freight railway system, on airports, things like this. So how are we going to sustain those connections to that global economy, and what role does infrastructure have to play in that? This conversation is kind of lost here in the US today. We'll get to that in just a minute. The third thing is our rapidly diversifying domestic energy portfolio and how disruptive that is. We know that the windfall of unconventional natural gas implicates transportation. For example, there's huge increases, as you can see, in barrels of crude that are moved on the railway system in just a few years, really dramatic increases. And rooftop solar really is exploding. In just the past year, we're seeing big changes in the energy portfolio. That's obviously, as we heard before, completely related to transportation or completely related to infrastructure. The financial challenges here are very complex, and we'll get to that in just a second. And then also high-profile natural disasters, things like Superstorm Sandy in New York City, really changed the conversation around making that connection between the built environment and the natural environment much more visible. The fact that it happened in New York City means that we're still talking about it. It's still very strongly felt. And places like New York are going to invest billions and billions of dollars over the next few years in what's so-called green infrastructure, trying to accommodate things like stormwater and rainwater in order to have that stuff naturally filter throughout the system, not having to build new infrastructure. So when we think about infrastructure, it's not always about big, new, massive projects, but how can we do things differently to obviate the need for building things differently? When you talk to civil engineers, sometimes these are things that aren't front and center, but sometimes infrastructure is not always the solution to our infrastructure challenges. And then the last disruptive change is how we're going to fund and finance projects here in the U.S. And this is the big one. And every infrastructure conversation, it seems like in the U.S. kind of defaults to this really quickly, and probably for good reason. We've underinvested in this country in infrastructure for decades. This shows the percentage of GDP that goes into infrastructure. And obviously people look at China and countries like that and see the massive amounts of building that are going on. But even peer countries like Canada, South Korea, Australia, much higher share of their spending is going to infrastructure than here in the United States. The other thing to understand is that a lot of this isn't coming from the federal government. And again, given the perch in Washington and given the national conversation, people just default to that. But we actually see a lot of scale back that's happening on the federal level right now. And a lot of this is popularly known because of what's happening with the Federal Highway Trust Fund. This is kind of a hard chart to see, but because we haven't raised the gasoline tax in 20 plus years, because, as I said, Americans are driving much less, because they're driving much more fuel-efficient cars, they're consuming less gas, paying less in the gas tax, and so we have less revenues going for transportation on the federal level. And this just projects that out over the next couple of years. Big declines. If we don't do anything, we're going to probably do something which is to keep it steady over the next couple of years, but we don't anticipate a whole lot of new resources coming from Washington anytime soon. Probably because there's really not a very big, robust conversation about infrastructure in Washington. But again, even if we had a functioning federal government right now, which you can argue that we do or do not have, there are structural changes that are happening to the federal budget that are going to impact things like infrastructure. But that infrastructure would fall under that discretionary spending category there at the bottom. Also, you include defense, you include housing, R&D, things like that, education fit under that category. But because of the rise in mandatory spending, because of the ballooning interest payments that we're going to have in the federal level in the next few decades, discretionary spending is just going to get squeezed out. No matter who's in charge, this is the reality that we're facing. So when we think about infrastructure, when we think about where the investments are going to come from, it's hard to think that the federal government is going to be leading the charge and that the cavalry is coming to the rescue anytime soon. The other challenge that we have is that the cities and the states are still reluctant to invest. We just came through, obviously, a very difficult economic recession when we saw cities, in particularly, scale back a lot of their spending. They weren't really borrowing, even though interest rates were very low. But this chart shows interest rates over time and shows what we have now. Even though it's ticking back up again, rates are still very low. But the question is, well, why then aren't cities and states investing? We think that the impacts from the recession are still very real and very strongly felt in places. They're still very reluctant to take on more debt. But then this means they're not really going to taking up municipal debt in order to invest in just basic infrastructure in these places. So cities and states, the federal government, if they're not going to do it, where is this investment going to come from? So the second thing I want to talk about then is how we're going to change this half century of bad habits and underinvestment. I think the problem that we have with infrastructure right now is that it's too abstract. We have made tremendous strides over the last 15 years, really since I've been doing this. That what I've seen is taking infrastructure out of the back rooms and the boardrooms of engineers and of advocates, really closer to the front burner of the American policy discourse. And that's a good thing. The challenge, though, it's just infrastructure broadly. It's infrastructure in just this ephemeral kind of way, and it's not really defined very tangibly for folks. And we have had the similar challenges in the U.S. We've had things fall down. We've had massive challenges and tragedies that have occurred because of infrastructure, but it hasn't really motivated that kind of public policy response. And I think it's because it's still too abstract. So I think there's three problems here. The first is that although we have made some progress, it's still a very simplistic conversation. Infrastructure is made up of these diverse sectors. Again, as we heard from the previous speaker, all these things, transport, energy, telecommunications, water, public buildings, all these things in the U.S. it's a system of systems, as we all know. They all work together. They connect up at the margins, right? All of these different sectors are designed, governed, financed, and delivered very, very differently. We try to think of them as one big thing, but they're actually not. And we know they're supposed to work together, but if we're trying to get some things done, we've got to deal with these different sectors as they exist right now, and they don't really link up as much as we think they do. The second thing is that we really overemphasize the federal role. I keep saying that, I feel like a broken record, but maybe it's just because of the purge here in Washington. We think that the federal government is going to do all these things, but even in just over the past 10 or 15 years, federal spending on these sectors, on transport and water, things that you expect there to be a lot of public sector investment, the federal share on that is only about 27%. So it matters. We certainly need the federal government to be a strong and reliable partner, but they even historically have not been the major investor in U.S. infrastructure today. And in other sectors, on freight rail and telecommunications, some other things, they have no really investments at all. So the federal government is not the major player in a lot of this stuff. The third thing is that because we talk about it abstractly, we fail then to connect infrastructure to these broad national economic challenges that we're facing. So when we talk about things like the global economy, the president had an economic initiative to double exports in 5 years, recognizing the demand that was increasing across the globe. Perfect economic strategy to put forth, a nice, big, bold thing. They never then connected that then to the infrastructure investments that we need. On freight, on ports, on rail, on things like that. So we've got to make those national economic or social or environmental objectives around sustainability or around connecting low-income workers to jobs. All of those things matter as big goals, but then there are infrastructure elements that are derivative of that. We fail to make those connections in this country, I think because the conversation is still too abstract. And then the big question then, when you think about all this stuff, is that we don't have any money, and how are we going to pay for the things that we need? So let me just wrap up then with just some thoughts about then how then we can make this better connection with infrastructure and the larger economy, how it affects people, and how we get stuff done at a really tumultuous time today. I think a lot of this stuff means that we're going to have to think about new kind of partnerships between the public and the private sector. And I don't just mean things like public-private partnerships in the way that it's popularly discussed today, or simplistic notions of privatization. It's not really what I'm talking about. It's true partnerships, right? It's the public and the private sector and the nonprofit sector working together to get some things done, and it's bottoms-up problem solving. It's not coming from Washington, but it's coming from cities and metros all across the country. Sometimes led by the government. You might have a strong mayor in a place like Los Angeles that's putting forth a new infrastructure proposal. You might have a philanthropy in a place like Detroit that recognizes the infrastructure investments they need to make. You might have the private sector in a place like Houston. So these are going to depend, it's a big country. There's big challenges. It's really complex. But I think that that's what we're going to be facing in the future, are new kinds of bottoms-up partnerships between all these different sectors to get some things done today. But there are certain things that are just going to be driven by the public sector because they don't either have a market mechanism, or the private sector is not interested in them, or because they provide some other kind of social and public good. And I think transportation and water largely fits into a lot of this category. And we see some of that happening. It's coming from the bottom up, particularly as it relates to ballot measures. It's hard to see. I think it's 73% of the ballot measures that were brought before voters in 2013 passed. So we're as we're trying to figure out where's the money going to come from, as policymakers are trying to figure out, well, how can we raise taxes to get some things done? They're taking these investments, they're going directly to the voters. They're saying, we're going to invest in this project. It's going to cost this much money. We're going to raise your sales tax or whatever, this much money. And the American public is very, very willing to invest in infrastructure when they're provided that kind of specificity. Infrastructure in the abstract, gas tax, the highway trust fund, these things are too ephemeral for anybody to really get interested in. But when you're specific, these things pass. We see that all the time. We also see states doing it themselves. So the gas tax gets a big conversation here on the national level, but 8 states just this year raised their own gasoline tax. The legislatures are getting together and recognize that they're going to have to do this. It's not just in blue states like Maryland and Rhode Island, places like that, but Georgia, Idaho, I think Nebraska, red states have also raised their own gasoline taxes. So the public sector is going to be involved in some of those areas, like in transport and in water. And so some good examples here. In Los Angeles, they passed something called Measure R. This was right in the middle of the recession. This was the city putting forth a big, bold infrastructure agenda that was designed to make Los Angeles a globally relevant, globally connected city. They needed 2/3 of the vote because of the weird things that happened in California, but they got this thing done. They got it actually done twice, and it's going to really transform Los Angeles. I don't know if anybody's been there lately, but you can really see these kinds of changes, moving it away from a car-centric, decentralized city and metropolitan area to something that's much more urban and globally oriented. We also see cities experimenting with their own assets that they have right now that are underutilized, because we usually would have the public sector coming in, or the federal government with these big investments. As those are changing, we see places like Washington that are starting to work together with the landowners around these stations to maximize the value that these infrastructure investments create. So we're able to get a brand new metro station built here, not too far from where we are right now on New York Avenue, because the private sector landowners adjacent to that station recognized that having a station there was going to increase their land value tremendously, and it absolutely did that. They were able to use then the land value capture mechanisms from the property tax or the property increases, invest that in the station. It's now the fastest growing station in the metro system today. So these are examples of where the public sector is starting to innovate with these new bottoms-up ideas. The federal government then, for their part, probably should be getting out of the way in a lot of ways and let the cities and the states and the metropolitan areas innovate. If they're not going to come forward with new revenue sources, if they're not going to come through with new innovative mechanisms, then how can the federal government actually be helpful? I think there's a couple of things they can do. They just need to get out of the way and stop putting restrictions on the ability of cities and metros to raise their own taxes. There's a good example around airports where they cap these passenger facility charges. Anybody flying out today may not like this, but we should be able to let places like Dallas, if they want to have a higher passenger facility charge to invest then in that airport, they should be allowed to do that. We also have federal restrictions on roadway pricing, on tolling on the interstates. All those things may have made sense 50 years ago. They don't make any more sense today. The federal government needs to get out of the way and provide more flexibility for places to innovate. So the second thing then is that I think there's going to be some projects in some sectors that are going to be perfectly ripe for investing with new public-private partnerships, where the private sector really has a direct role to play and is sharing the risks and the rewards with the public sector. These are heretofore previously thought of as just public sector investments. There's a big gold rush, I think, around this right now. People, particularly cities, are starting to think that, well, maybe the private sector wants to come in and invest in some of the things that we have. It's true in some ways, but it's not going to change, I think, everything. But it's important to talk about. There are different levels of public sector and private sector engagement, depending on the project. We don't have to talk about this chart. It's hard to see anyway. But the point here being that there's not going to be one model for every project in every single place. For the most part, it looks like the public sector is going to retain ownership of the asset at the back end. They're going to identify the need at the front end, and then how the private sector interacts with that, whether they're doing the construction, whether they're doing the financing, whether they're doing the design, is all going to depend on the structure of the contract and the particular investment that we're trying to make. So again, in the abstract, it doesn't really work, but when you get specific, I think we're going to start to see a lot of really interesting investments, which I'll talk about in just a second. But one thing that we need first is that we need some level of sophistication. In the United States, this is brand new for us. Other countries like the UK have done this for years, but in the US, we're actually still laggards when it comes to taking advantage of public and private partnerships. So we really like this idea that they're doing out in the West Coast, but this idea called the infrastructure exchange. It's not a funding entity. They're not going to provide direct funding for projects, but they're trying to do things like provide standardization on contracts to help with capacity for negotiations. So how can we build the capacity on the public side to help them deal with some of the interest on the private side, and then build a market in these places? So it's not just one-off projects here, one-off projects there, but there's really kind of a menu of things that are potentially ripe for public-private partnerships. And one good example to talk about is in Bayonne, in my home state of New Jersey, where the city was overburdened with an awful lot of debt, an awful lot of reluctance to raise taxes, but they had a tremendous asset, which is in their water utility that was there. They worked with a group of private investors who came in, who bought off the debt, because they recognized that there was value in this asset. They could help balance the city's books. They could actually make the utility a much more effective and efficient server of water in this city. This is kind of a brand new project. I don't think we really see the lessons yet, but they have, in a place like New Jersey, they've got to be sure that they are protecting the workers. They've committed to do that. I think this is going to be a really interesting one to follow here in the future. The third thing then is that there are going to be other areas where the private sector is going to just dominate, because they always have dominated. Historically, it's what they've done here in the United States. These are just sectors of infrastructure where the public sector hasn't had a big role to play. The change that I think is going to happen, though, is that, again, it's more of these partnerships. It's more connecting those infrastructure assets to public policy goals and objectives that are related to these, again, the economic, environmental, social objectives that we're trying to achieve. So in broadband networks, for example, the private sector is responsible, for the most part, in building these out all across the country. Los Angeles is very interested in connecting particularly low-income neighborhoods with broadband networks. So they're trying to figure out how can we connect these private sector investments in broadband, which are, at the end of the day, a profit-making venture, with these public policy goals to get infrastructure and broadband into low-income neighborhoods mostly to connect kids up to the education system. So they're working right now to figure out how that works. So the point here to take away is that it's a private sector investment that are starting to have more public policy goals and objectives. Similarly, in New York, where real estate is obviously, for the most part, a private sector venture, the city is trying to diversify its economy away from just financial, trying to have more of an advanced industry and a technological bent. And they have an awful lot of land there on Roosevelt Island in the East River that they want to invest in. This is not just opening it up and just hoping that the private sector makes the right investments in real estate and attracts the right kind of firms, but helping guide that and helping to make sure that the private universities and the tech firms that come in there are actually advancing broader city goals for the diversified economy. In Detroit and other places, we actually see this happening as well. So I'm going to go ahead and end there, but I think that the bottom line, the thing I want you to take away is that regardless of the funding arrangement, I think it's clear that the projects are getting more complex. And what we're starting to see is more of this joining up between the public sector goals and the private sector goals, and how we can marry those together that are actually investing in the infrastructure projects that matter for the U.S. economy going forward. I do think that our ability to realize our competitive potential does depend on making those right kind of infrastructure assets. Historically, you look at all countries across the world, and we see that you've got to have the right kind of built environment in order to have a functioning economy. But we've got to respond, and we've got to be clear about these disruptive changes that are happening right now. This is not 1950. This is not 1970. There are an awful lot of things that are happening right now that have to be part of this conversation. And we have to respond to the financial and the political challenges. Again, I just don't see Washington coming to the rescue anytime soon. But this is America. It doesn't mean that we're just going to give up and just forget about it, but we're going to see things that are coming from the bottom up. That's where most of the problem solving is coming from. It's where more of the innovation is happening, and I look forward to the future when we're starting to make these broader connections. I want to thank you very much for having me here today. I look forward to the questions and answers.